If a week is a long time in politics, 2 weeks can feel like a lifetime. Much has happened since we were with you a fortnight ago. A UK-EU reset, Robert Jenrick becoming a vigilante, and Nigel Farage becoming a socialist. They're just the highlights. Internationally, the Gaza conflict has sunk to new depths of depravity. The Ukraine war rages on. Poland has elected a populist president. Elon Musk has left the White House. Trump's tariffs are back. And King Charles opened the Canadian Parliament. We also learned what you need in order to appear on every major BBC current affairs programme. 5 MPs. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
So welcome back to the Den, everyone. And it's been 2 weeks since the Downtown Den Politics podcast aired. It's been 3 weeks, I think, since we were all together. And when I say all, I mean, of course, the wonderful, the fabulous Joe Phillips and the political oracle that is James Hancock. So fabulous to see you both on this wonderful Monday morning. And let's get into some of the things that have been going on during that fortnight and unpick it for our listeners, starting with that new deal that Keir Starmer and the European Union came to. And I think that there was probably more in it than people like you and I anticipated. Not as much as we'd like, of course, because we would want to see him going, what's the phrase? Further and faster.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, there was some good stuff in it. You know, barriers lifted in terms of agri-food. You've got potentially the use of e-gates for us next year when we all go on holiday. That'd be nice to see. There are talks progressing, I understand, quite favourably in terms of, we won't call it freedom of movement of young people, but certainly a more relaxed approach to allowing, let's call it, student exchanges happening between the EU and the UK. And the big one, of course, pet passports. So I think Keir Starmer did a decent enough job. But as I say, we would always like to see more being done as far as that reset of the European Union relationship is concerned. Joe, what did you make of it?
Well, pretty much as you said, Frank. Yes, I would have liked him to go much further, much faster, and be much more upfront, because I think we all know that, you know, the people who voted leave, many of them regret it. The people that desperately want to reset want it done absolutely clearly, and he needs to stop equivocating. You know, if the people who don't want to reset with Europe are never going to vote for Keir Starmer anyway. So, but I think it is encouraging. I think what is encouraging is the relationships he's clearly got with most of the other European leaders, given that Europe in some sense is in some turmoil too. You know, Macron he's okay at the moment, but he's had a rocky ride. Germany's got a new chancellor. You know, it's not as easy or as smooth. There are lots of other things going on, but I think he's done a good job. Of course, the headlines were all about, oh, he's sold out our fish. He's sold our fishermen down the rivers, without anybody stopping to say, hang on a minute, nearly all of our fish goes to Europe and most of it gets sent back and has to be thrown away because of the delays and bureaucracy and red tape caused by Brexit. So I think the most important and the most significant thing for everybody is this agreement on the veterinary and what they call the phytosanitary stuff, which is on food regulations, which will make life easier for export and import, and it should ultimately mean, if not in lower prices, at least not an increase in prices for consumers.
Yeah, as I say, I thought it was glass half full when that particular summit had finished. And of course, the other announcement that was made, this is going to be an annual event, so we can expect further negotiations moving forward. We do get very exercised, though, Jim, don't we, about protecting our waters and fishermen. And when you consider it's quite literally 0.1% of UK industry is fishing, it does rather beg the question, why do we get so excited about it?
Well, it's a bit like the people coming across in boats, which I think is a very serious problem, but it's a tiny percentage of the issues causing the migration crisis. It's symbolic, everybody identifies with these brave people that go out in storms to get fish for us. So that's why it assumes this importance. But you're right, in terms of the British economy, it's much less. And you've made the point about, because I've seen a split reaction, fishermen and fishers, sorry, are concerned about the 12-year agreement that's been put in place, but people who actually sell fish, particularly shellfish, into the European Union are quite pleased. But I mean, let's get to the main meat of it. I mean, pint half full. I'm almost like a third full. Important things, particularly one thing we haven't mentioned yet is sort of defence access, that we're going to have access to defence equipment, that sort of nonsense the French were putting up, whilst on the one hand saying that we're all in it together against Russia, and then trying to sort of mess about with us, our eligibility to apply for defence equipment contracts. So that's important. The agri-food stuff is also very important, because stuff was perishing on the docks at Dover. Some easement on student exchanges, but the three red lines on customs union, etc., are incredibly restrictive yet. There's no, as I forecast, there's been no movement on musicians. And we're talking about the cultural industries at the moment, who are under pressure for a number of things, including the AI crisis, which we probably won't have time to talk about today. And obviously the fishing thing was way beyond the period that we wanted to negotiate. E-gates, Frank, it's going to be a country by country decision. And some friends of mine have said, will the French really let us in through the normal channels? Let's wait and see. And I mention that because it's one of the most relevant things for people. It's one of the most annoying, and for me, humiliating examples of the damage of Brexit that we have to queue up. So, the government is still constrained by the timidity over Europe.
It's that political balance that he's trying to strike, Jim, and it's whether you go with Joe's point, which is Brexiteers are not going to vote Labour anyway, or whether you think actually there are other issues in which you may be able to win those voters over. And I guess Starmer at this moment in time is betwixt and between. The encouraging thing, as far as I'm concerned, is this was a first step, whether it be small, medium or large. It was a step in the right direction. And like you, Jim, I think that people will view the things that are happening more strategically, like defence, like agri-food, with some interest. But the stuff that's really going to impact them is if they can start getting through those gates quicker when they go on holiday. That would be a huge boost to Keir Starmer and the government, as daft as it sounds. And I said flippantly the big one was pet passports. Honestly, the number of people who said to me, oh, that's fantastic. The fact that we can actually take our pets to Europe again, this is brilliant. So I think there's movement which has been positive. I think we were always going to be disappointed as keen Europhiles in terms of the announcement that was made, but it did go a bit further than I'd anticipated. So hopefully, as I say, in future summits, we'll start to see some of those you described, Jim, red lines, be rubbed out, disappear, and we can crack on increasingly as the economic dial fails to move as much as Rachel Reeves would want. Then the silver bullet, in a sense, will be to get a much more robust deal with the European Union, because that's the way in which we can improve our economic performance. Just finally on this, Joe, because as I say, I think the future relationship with the EU is going to potentially change dramatically. But you made the point, Europe itself at the moment is in some turmoil, and you said, interestingly, Macron's okay at the moment. I mean, his wife gave him a dig last week. That didn't look particularly good, did it, for the optics? And he's been put on the back foot. And I don't mean that in a pun, as a pun, because usually French presidents, their private life, they get away with all sorts of things. They've usually got at least one mistress, maybe several on the go, and nobody gives a toss. But this has, even from the French public's perception, been, again, no pun intended, a blow to Macron's authority. Then you've got new Chancellor in Germany, who's trying to hold together this quite fragile coalition. And then we'll talk about this in the second part of the programme, the result coming out of Poland. But against that backdrop, it's going to be quite tough to navigate these deals, isn't it, moving forward?
Yeah, I think so. And I think actually, although we might have wished for more, I think it's really important to note that this is within the first year of this government, along with everything else that they've had to deal with unexpectedly and some expected things. But actually, while people criticise the Labour government, and rightly in my book, for some of the decisions they've made, he has actually pursued this European path quite doggedly, quite sensibly, and in quite a strategic way. I think the big issue, and Jim just touched on it, is immigration. And this issue that has really come to the fore over the weekend, because we've had fine weather, record number of crossings over the Channel, and these pictures that have been, spread around the world of French police standing there watching migrants getting into boats. And we have, through successive governments, including this one, given billions of pounds to France to try and do something about this. And I think that is something, in order to get a better relationship. There was a French politician on the radio earlier this morning, and she said, well, it's because of Brexit. We know that, but that doesn't solve the problem. And I think it's going to be a very big problem that his opponents, Keir Starmer's opponents, will make hay with. So he needs to do something with France pretty rapidly on that.
Those images look terrible, Jim, don't they?
Can I just break in, Fran? Did we know, we pay these millions of pounds, and apparently the French can't dip their toes in the water on the beach. As soon as they get into the tiniest bit of shallow water, the French, oh no, we're not touching it with a barge pole. I mean, surely before we started paying them money, that sort of thing should have been clarified. I mean, it's a joke.
Yeah, as I say, the images look appalling, and really bad news for the government, who are saying that they're getting a grip of immigration. Of course, figures were announced during this past fortnight that immigration has halved in this country, and the government can't take credit for that, in a sense, because a lot of the reasoning as to why those figures have reduced is because of measures that were taken by Rishi Sunak's government, actually. Nevertheless, the numbers have reduced, but as you both rightly said, it doesn't much matter what those official figures are doing. If people are seeing people coming across on boats and the numbers that they're coming across, then that is going to piss people off, and they really do need to try and get a grip of it. John Healey going on the news yesterday saying we've lost control of our borders didn't really help. The context of that, of course, was he was saying over the past 5 years, but John should know better as an experienced politician that sort of line is going to be used in evidence against you. One final thing on Labour before we move on to the Conservatives. Jim, it looks as though you might be getting your winter fuel allowance back, mate.
Yes. I mean, there's a number of things developing on this front, and we might have a word. I'm interested in your views on both of you on the position of the Chancellor, because that is a sort of screeching new turn. There's also talk about easing up on some of the benefit things. And last week, the dreaded Treasury book for deciding where investment is best made, which has blighted the north of England, and you know this, Frank, from years of experience of dealing with devolution issues. We've always struggled to justify infrastructure expenditure in the north of England because we haven't got the population. You know, in London, you can propose Crossrail or the Elizabeth line, and you've got the millions of people, and the Treasury just ticks it off. Obviously, there's less people overall in the north, although we've got substantial cities and so on. And there's talk about bending the rules. Now, whether that's a breach of the overall, you know, because the Chancellor's made a big thing about how I'm not going to break my ironclad rules. But, you know, overall, we're seeing Rachel Reeves under intense pressure, probably from the Prime Minister, because you always get this tension develops between the Chancellor trying to deal with the purse strings and the Prime Minister saying, hang on a minute, have you not seen the opinion polls? But does there come a point where, you know, Rachel Reeves has made such a thing about fiscal responsibility that if she's made to make a number of screeching U-turns, her credibility begins to be called into doubt? But she's under intense pressure, and we've got the spending review coming up very imminently now.
Yes, spending review will be announced later this month, I think around the 11th, 12th of June. So also interestingly, Angela Rayner spoke at a property conference I was at last week, UK Reef in Leeds, and she was indicating that the ask from Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham for this new Liverpool-Manchester link will happen. So that was interesting. Now, Angela Rayner's not the Chancellor, but nevertheless, she seemed fairly confident in making that announcement. I think Rachel Reeves, despite all of that, is still secure in a job, because I think that the decisions that she's taken have been supported by the Prime Minister quite robustly. And it's only the aftermath and the public reaction that started to see them backtracking on some of this stuff. And of course, the Runcorn by-election defeat has brought things into sharp focus as well. So we'll wait and see. But Joe, I don't think Rachel Reeves is under threat in terms of a position at the moment. What do you think?
I think she's probably okay, but as they say in Scotland, I would say that her coat is hanging on a shoogly nail. I think I don't, you know, she might get through this year. It would be bad form, I think, for the government to lose a chancellor within the first year of government. And, you know, who do you replace her with? Well, Darren Jones, you know, maybe move Wes Streeting, although he wants to stay at Health until he can move into number 10. I mean, she's probably is okay. But I think the thing on the U-turns is you can't look as though you're only reacting to Nigel Farage and reform. You know, either you're reacting to what people are saying, which is, for goodness sake, this isn't going to work. But, you know, if you're going to do it, we've got nearly a year on since it was announced. It seems a bit pointless to U-turn on winter fuel, because if you're going to do that, what about the two-child benefit cap? And what about the inheritance tax for farmers, you know, the small family farms? So there's all of those sort of things. And I think, you know, we're seeing a possibility, very, very ill-judged in my view, by the BMA, the British Medical Association, of threats of strikes over doctors' pay, which, you know, is not helpful to anybody. And it's no good saying, well, our wages have been frozen since, you know, 1947 or something. All of our wages have, all of our incomes have. So it's a fairly fatuous argument, and I don't think they will have public support. You know, there is no doubt there are lots of rumblings, and I think, you know, if you look at it in the cold light of Labour government cuts foreign aid, Labour government cuts pensioners' winter fuel, Labour government spends a fortune on weapons, it's not where many people feel comfortable. So I think there's a bigger issue about the sort of philosophical essence of where we are today, what Labour stands for. But I do think he needs to be careful of trying to follow reform, because all that will happen is that the Liberal Democrats, who get no coverage whatsoever, just quietly scoop up, you know, the One Nation Tories and the disaffected Labour members.
Well, we will come on to reform a little later, but let's turn our attention to the Conservatives, who are flatlining in the polls, running third or fourth in some opinion polls, actually, Kemi Badenoch appears to be really struggling in the position as leader of the opposition, not cutting through at all. Conservative Home, which is the sort of influential newsletter that is published on a daily basis by conservative activists. I think the last poll I saw, Kemi Badenoch was, if not bottom of the popularity stakes amongst Tory members, certainly near the bottom. And these, of course, are the people who elected her only a year ago. So Jenrick is on manoeuvres, and arguably Robert Jenrick has been on manoeuvres since the day after he lost that leadership election. But he's shown a bit of energy, and he's been out to the London Underground acting as a vigilante, challenging people who are fare dodging. Now, aside from the fact that I can imagine his security detail having kittens when he was undertaking that particular ruse, he's also reopened some of his past misdemeanors, James, including this multi-million-pound deal he signed off for a housing development in London. He was found, of course, to have acted wrongly. I'll put it no more strongly than that. But it does, I think, demonstrate the dangers of the Tories opting for Jenrick anytime soon, because he's got a closet full of crap that opponents will be able to throw at him. So first of all, I'm going to ask you, Jim, what did you make of his vigilante activity? And secondly, do you think he'd be a better choice for the Tories than the current leader?
A straight answer to that question, and I'm no fan of Robert Jenrick, is yes. The huge issue is the semi-invisibility of the leader whilst Jenrick is making the weather. And we all know that, you know, making the weather, you have to feed the media, social media and the classic media machine pretty regularly, otherwise you'll be completely ignored. And the fact of the matter is that this man is absolutely getting the headlines at the moment. I mean, the particular thing, as you say, I mean, he, you know, you can say it was reckless or courageous. I mean, he was, to actually challenge people. I mean, I think one guy said, "I've got a knife" or something. He's, "Oh, you've got a knife, have you?" I mean, this was pretty heavy stuff, but it's drawn attention to the thing. Now, obviously, Jenrick is no fool, and you know, he included a reference to Turkish barber shops, I think. So there's always this dog whistle thing with him. But, you know, for the Conservative Party in the situation that they're in with reform, obviously Keir Starmer has felt the need to react to reform. And so does the Conservative Party, I suppose, although it risks, I mean, Joe has eloquently pointed out the great risk for the Conservative Party with the One Nation Tories going off towards the Liberal Democrats if this carries on. But he is responding to it. And frankly, you know, the Kemi Badenoch is so low profile. I mean, she's very stubborn about this business about I'm not developing policies until I've gone through it all with a fine tooth comb, which is admirable in one way, but the absence of policies, you know, is very difficult. Jenrick is energetic. He's very eloquent in putting his points of view. Obviously, there are skeletons in his cupboard. But, you know, I mean, you asked me a direct question, and I just think because of Badenoch's inadequacies and Jenrick's, you know, energy, he should be leader. But of course, then we come up against the final point I want to make is the incredible pantomime that we've had, you know, almost every 2 years changing the leader. That is an issue for the party. And I think that's the one thing that will probably keep Badenoch in her place.
Well, until the next local elections, I guess, next year when they do face another pasting. I think the other big problem for the Conservatives, though, as well as this reluctance to develop policy, which is understandable, actually, so far out from a general election, but it's their inability to apologise for any of the nonsense that they put us through over the past 14 years. So you don't have to say principally you were wrong in terms of the Rwanda scheme, but you've certainly got to apologise for the fact that you spent hundreds of millions of pounds and didn't deport one single person. You don't necessarily have to take all of the blame for the prison crisis that we've endured in this country, but surely you have to at least start to acknowledge that perhaps some of the decisions that you took when you were in government contributed to that crisis. You don't necessarily have to say that Keir Starmer is the best thing in sliced bread without suggesting that Boris Johnson having parties during lockdown wasn't the best idea in the world. And I think all of those things, Jim, you can pull a face, but honestly, you know, if there was one criticism I made of Ed, well, there was many criticisms I made of Ed Miliband when he was leader of the Labour Party. But I tell you one thing you couldn't say about Ed Miliband. He didn't shy away from saying, we got it wrong on Iraq. We didn't basically keep an eye on what the banks and the financial institutions were up to. He acknowledged the fact that that Labour government did not get everything right. And what I see from Tory spokespeople and from the leader is this absolute lack of self-awareness. And I think, Joe, that is... Sorry, go on, Jim. I'll let you come back. I think it's killing them.
Two things very quickly. I mean, to be fair, even yesterday, Robert Jenrick he was talking about, this other idea, of course, is to give firearms to prison officers in high security jails. And during the course of that interview, he did say we got things wrong and so on. So I think there have been his apologies. And one last point, I think the shelf life of we got things wrong, and also Labour finding £22 billion black hole, I think the shelf life of those two positions is beginning to wear out. And so I think probably, I have a slight disagreement, but I think we've had the Tory apologies. I think we've got it from Labour that they inherited a horrible situation. And I think we need, a year on from that, we need to move on. But see what Joe says.
Well, I would slightly take issue with that. And I think, yes, there have been some half-hearted apologies. It's not just the black hole that this government inherited. It is the fact that, when the Conservatives are criticising Shabana Mahmood for changes or plans to implement the former Tory Justice Secretary David Cork's proposals in order to do something about prisons, is because they didn't build any new prisons and they didn't do anything about overcrowding, and they continued to cut funding to the probation services and everything else. So
they made such a mess of things that they should remain silent on everything.
Yes. But I do think there is a point, and I think, I agree with Frank on this. It's not so much about, we screwed up on the money. It's actually we screwed up because we were too busy having parties in Downing Street. And just very quickly to go back to the Robert Jenrick thing, those things that he was doing, they're all things that irritate people. Fare dodgers, loud music on public transport. Why have we got 14 barbers in a tiny village where the baker and the pubs close? All of those things are what people talk about. They're all things that if in another world, the government was to say, we are going to have a ban on Turkish barbers, fare dodgers will be, marched away and put in the stocks, and anybody, as the Liberal Democrats have said, anybody with playing music or using a phone without headphones will be fined £1,000. The Tories would have gone, oh, this is a nanny state. The thing that Jenrick is doing, though, is he is connecting in a way that Kemi Badenoch is so disconnected from the public, from her party. And, she's only got to do one job once a week, Prime Minister's questions. So how you can get it so spectacularly wrong to say to the Prime Minister, are you making any changes to the winter fuel allowance after he's just announced it? It just beggars belief that she could be so useless.
It does make me smile when Jim says, oh, it's a year now, since the election and since all that Tory nonsense, when Boris Johnson was standing up and berating Keir Starmer over things that Tony Blair had done in 1997. But there you go, double standards, doesn't surprise me from somebody with BBC training. Anyway, let's move on to the BBC's favourite political personality, and that, of course, is Reform's Nigel Farage. And Mr. Farage disappeared on holiday. when Parliament was debating that EU-UK reset, but he was back the following week when Parliament wasn't sitting to basically host a press conference that, guess what, the whole of our media descended upon to hear what Nigel had to say. And what did the great man offer us? Well, I tell you what, Jim, he's going to scrap two-child benefits. He's going to scrap the winter fuel allowance, bring all that back, he says, in full. Of course, what he doesn't tell you is how he's going to pay for it, other than, well, we'll save on all this waste that's happening. And, you know, we all know that there's billions of pounds out there as far as that is concerned. On a serious note, again, I think that the opposition parties, Labour and the Conservatives, have made the right haulics in terms of their response to that particular stunt that Farage pulled, because they both appear to have basically said, Nigel's right, don't vote for him. You know, Starmer was out of the blocks the following day, leaks to the press saying, well, Keir really wants to scrap the two-child benefit cap rule as well. Of course, the winter fuel announcement had already been made the week previously. Jenrick's, as we've said, moving into reform territory as quick as he possibly can. It seems to me that there is a total lack of strategic leadership from both the government and the official opposition, and reform are being allowed to make the political weather. Joe, as a political advisor and communications person, what's going on? Are they simply caught in the inevitable consequence of the media having this love-in with Farage and reform, or is there a way in which they could tackle this more effectively?
Well, one of the things that I would have not let Keir Starmer do had I been advising him was basically to recognise reform as the official opposition. I mean, he's got 5 MPs. The Greens have got 5 MPs. When was the last time you heard from the Greens, other than, you know, a tick box exercise during the local election campaign? When was the last time you heard from the Liberal Democrats, except, again, a tick box, putting somebody on question time or any questions or something like that? It is utterly ludicrous that the Prime Minister will go publicly in a press conference. Yes, he can say the Tories are irrelevant. We know that. But to make it so that the fight is with reform with 5 MPs, you know, all we have to do, and this may be wishful thinking on my part, is wait and see how they run the councils that they are now taking control of. I mean, as far as I know, they're ripping down Ukraine flags. They're banning pride flags and rainbow flags and all the rest of it. They're going to slash waste. Don't know how they're going to do that, because they can't cut social care. They can't cut education or transport budgets. They can't stop sending kids with special needs in taxis in rural areas because there's no public transport. So I think, you know, we will judge them by the way they behave in government at local level. And that would have been a far more sensible thing to do. And I completely agree with you. And, you know, as people know, I do appear on GB News alongside Nigel Farage quite frequently. But I think the BBC and some of the papers are so obsessed, they're almost willing him into Downing Street, as though it's some sort of, you know, popularity contest. And if it's a popularity contest, yes, of course he would win, because he's much more charismatic than Keir Starmer, and as we've just discussed, certainly more than Kemi Badenoch, but then so is a stone. But I think, you know, what you have to do is to look at the other things and look underneath what he's saying. I mean, there's a really interesting article in The Guardian today that this whole thing about we need to have more babies, we're going to lift the two-child benefit gap, but only for British families. You know, that's the underlying message. And then you get into, we want more British babies. So are we going to see, you know, clamp down on abortion? Are we going to see all sorts of other things? Are we going to see a real division in white babies and not white babies? Because that's what the underlying stuff is. All of this, you know, cheeky chappy, have a pint, I know what it's like to be working class. it doesn't matter what class you are. You know, Michael Heseltine was more in touch with real people, and no one could ever accuse him of being working class. But it's that bigger, broader picture. It's just unfortunate that in today's political landscape, everything is about now, and it's about the image. And, you know, Nigel Farage has got that off to a T.
I was surprised that Keir Starmer decided to come to the Northwest and basically dedicate a speech aimed at Nigel Farage. I think it would have been far more sensible to put, let's say, Angela Rayner up to basically take on the issues that Farage had raised and basically say to Farage, where's the money coming from? And I'd have left it as simple as that. I'd have just left it hanging. I wouldn't have gone on, you know, to a platform as Prime Minister to basically, as I say, dedicated to a leader of a fourth, fifth or sixth party. But Jim, Farage, as I say, is making the political weather, and the Tories and Labour don't seem to know how to handle it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, that maybe Angela Rayner should have been put up to do it. I mean, her appearances seem to be fairly sparse, and that's another conversation that we could have. But
pretty good when she was on BBC and Sky last week, though, I have to say. I thought she did well.
Yes, but I don't think there's a feeling that she's not so much in the loop as she ought to be, and that I think would be unwise. I mean, Mr. Farage went on holiday when Parliament was sitting and the media had plenty to cover, and came back in a week when there was no political news, and brilliantly dominated the airwaves. And, you know, it's all very well saying the BBC should have stayed away, but I don't think that's realistic. All this business about they've only got 5 MPs, that's of course true, but they have 53 councillors in Lancashire. Labour was nearly wiped out. They're leading in the opinion polls. You know, I'm not quite sure what you two are suggesting. You know, if they don't take on the reform challenge, then they'll be accused of running away or having nothing to say.
I don't think they are taking on the reform challenge, though. That's the problem, Jim. They're agreeing with what Nigel Farage is saying. So instead of challenging the premise that you can simply return the whole of the winter fuel allowance in the way that it was previously budgeted for, to simply say, yes, we're going to reintroduce benefits for kids, you know, for more than 2 children in families. You basically, as I said earlier, you're saying Nigel's right, but don't vote for him. At some point, when are the government and indeed the opposition, you've made this point about lack of policy, but certainly when are the government going to start to tell their story so that Nigel Farage and co need to react to them? And I know it's easier in opposition because you can say whatever you want, but there must be a better way, in my view, of handling reform than simply trying to take them on the issues that they want you to be talking about, whether it be immigration, whether it be winter fuel allowance. You know, this is the thing that, in my view, the government have got wrong. They are not managing the political weather whatsoever, Jim. It's frustrating.
Well, just one last word from me. I mean, I thought the speech was a little bit more comprehensive than that. I mean, it is tricky because, as you say, the winter fuel allowance and the 2-child benefit thing are Farage territory. But, you know, Starmer's speech was more comprehensive than that because, of course, the reform are also committed to raising income tax levels to £20,000, and that's a huge bill. So he was comprehensively attacking their economic strategy. But just a word on the 2-child benefit. It's an interesting one, this, because whilst winter fuel, I think, was desperately unpopular, there are people, don't let's forget the impulse for this in the first place was very large families getting huge numbers of benefits for 8 or 9 children. And to be the only thing I would say about Kemi Badenoch, the Conservatives are the only party now standing out in favour of 2-child benefit, which I think in a desert of disappointment is the one thing that Kemi Badenoch has got right.
All the polls show, Jim, that there is support still for that cap to remain. So you're quite right. You know, politically, it's not the most popular thing. But this, Farage turning into Jeremy Corbyn and getting away with it is driving me mad.
Yeah, I think you're right, Frank, and I think that I think Angela Rayner should be up against Nigel Farage because she's much more feisty, she's much more pugnacious. I don't think the Prime Minister should be getting involved in it.
No.
I think and what you need to be challenging reform on, and that includes the BBC and the rest of the media. They need to be challenging them on their policies because they constantly get an easy ride. And whilst you can be charismatic and do all of those things, as Farage does, as Jenrick does to a certain extent, as Boris Johnson did, all of those people, what would you do with them? Put them in a box somewhere. But actually, what you need to be doing is saying, right, okay, tell us how you're going to cost this, and stop prevaricating about you don't know. What money are you going to raise from not having asylum hotels? Right, so where are you going to put asylum seekers? How much is that going to? It's not difficult to actually challenge the policies, because when you see people begin to wriggle or come up with plausible answers, then you can take them seriously. But until then, you're just saying, well, I want to be like you, but not quite like you.
Yeah, I mean, I did see Victoria Derbyshire take apart Sarah Pochen, the Reform MP now for Runcorn, on how you're going to sort the boat crisis out.
Yeah.
And she was clueless. I mean, she absolutely, she made her look as daft as apparently she is, I'm told. But I think the fact that, you have, I think every week now, they manage to somehow shoehorn a Reform MP, a Reform councillor, Reform spokesperson. Tim Montgomery's on all sorts of things now. He's a member of Reform. And Lib Dems nowhere to be seen.
No.
I don't get it. I really don't get how we've got a supposedly independent, impartial BBC that are given so much airtime to
And the Liberal
Reform.
Democrats
And I
have
don't
got-
know how you can continue to defend it, Jim.
Well, and the Liberal Democrats have got more councillors than Reform and the Tories put together.
Yeah.
They actually were the biggest winners in the local elections, although you wouldn't think it. I mean, if I was doing my old job, I'd be on the phone every single day and marching into people's offices saying, what the hell are you playing at? They should be the official opposition.
And maybe that's the problem. Maybe, the Liberal Democrats aren't being as robust as they need to. They need to get the bloody elbows out, because it's, I don't know, I joke about it. I know Jim pushes back on this, but I can't get my head around it, Jim. 5 MPs. And, it's, if you go back to the days when, DUP probably have 5 MPs. Enoch Powell wasn't on fucking telly every week. It just drives me crackers. I don't know where the BBC are coming from.
Well, the Ulster Unionists, it presents a particular issue because obviously...
No, I was being flippant, but you know what I'm saying? There is no political personality over the last 20 years that has been given as much airtime by the BBC as Nigel Farage.
I think you're right that the Liberal Democrats should be more vociferous in getting airtime. I do agree with that. The BBC would say that, it's not... The people's appearances on the television are not just because of the last general election. They have to reflect the current opinion polls. And also, to be honest, the novelty factor is always going to be prevalent. Now, the BBC should be less responsive to that sort of populism than perhaps they are. I would agree with that. But that's the news agenda on the whole. Farage captures the headlines. He is a novelty act. And that's part of the reason why he's getting so much publicity. But I do take your point about the Liberal Democrats should be, present a lot more, putting forward their strong views on Europe and social care. I mean, social care seems to have faded into the background. This is ticking time bomb, but the Lib Dems have the courage to put that forward. The problem is that, of course, it's not as sexy as Nigel Farage spouting off about something, to talk about the social care thing. This is the journalistic truth about it. But I do agree with you. The BBC have got to be better than that. I understand what you're saying, but they're sort of reflecting the current position.
BBC's job, Jim, isn't it? The BBC's job ought to be to actually treat politics as a serious profession
absolutely.
rather than an extension of the entertainment industry. And I'm afraid that they have fallen into the trap of, and again, it pushed back a little, Jim. Opinion polls weren't particularly kind to Nigel Farage when he was appearing on Question Time every other week, and he was leader of UKIP, or whatever name his political party was under that particular time. And the excuse then was, well, he's a European Member of Parliament. There's no other MEP in the history of the European Parliament appeared more on Question Time than Nigel Farage. In fact, I don't remember another MEP ever being on Question Time. So there's been this fascination with this guy. And I'm afraid that the BBC have given in to, whether it be people who are still running the Beeb, because there are still people who are appointed by the previous government who are on the board of governors there, whether it be the fact that they're chasing Daily Mail readers. I don't know what it is, but we talk about the Liberal Democrats getting their elbows out, and I think they should. But what the bloody hell are the government doing to say to the BBC, hey, you lot, get yourselves sorted out, start treating politics seriously again, otherwise we're going to start looking at your licence fees. And we're going to start to put you under the same sort of scrutiny that the last lot did, because clearly what you respond to is threats and bullying.
Yeah, well, Ofcom need to be a bit more robust. And, if rumours are true, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport is going to be scrapped, which would be an appalling thing to do.
I don't think that's going to happen, actually, Joe. That's been
I hope
very,
not.
very fair.
I mean, just very quickly on the whole, reform and balancing. All the BBC has to do, actually, to make it appear fairer is to not have Nigel Farage. Have a reform person, but let's see some of the other people. Let's see them.
But no, they've honestly, Joe, they've had Montgomery's been on all sorts of stuff. Yeah. You've had Lee Anderson's been on recently. I've mentioned Sarah Poachin. Who's the other? Tice. They've all had a go.
Yeah, I mean,
they're all getting a. And I couldn't tell you, other than Ed Davey, the name of a Liberal Democrat MP. They're so low profile. So that's got to be sorted. Listen, we're going to have to move on because I've got a very important appointment at Everton Football Club shortly. I'm selecting the Everton Fan Advisory Board representative. So it's a very important task that I've got to endure. So let's move on. And we're going to change the format this week, folks. So we're going to say goodbye for now. But tomorrow, Tuesday, you will be able to hear our comments and commentary on those international affairs I mentioned at the top of the programme. So come back tomorrow to listen to what we've got to say as far as that's concerned. For now, it's goodbye from me, from Jim, and from Joe. See you tomorrow.